My name's Scot, Lasensky. I work at the Institute of Peace. For those who don't know the Institute of Peace, the Arab-Israeli issue has long been a very central concern of the Institute. In all of our activities, we're deeply engaged on this question in terms of our grant making, nearly 100 grants in the last 20 years, over $5 million. Our research and analytical work very much focused on this question. Some of the reports are out in the front. Our training and teaching activities very much focused on dealing with Israeli and Arab teachers, lawyers, people in civil society, and our NGO work, because we also are active on the ground. We have Institute staff working in the region on this question. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. Some members of the panel told me if you're going to email or text them during the session, they will have their phones off. So, and if you could turn off your phones as well. We're going to have a first half is going to be set sort of a conversation format, and then after we'll take questions from the audience. And we have members of the staff with wireless microphones, and we'll try to call on everyone. And if we can't get to everyone, we can continue the discussion off air afterwards out in the hallway. The event, just to remind everybody, is on the record. Just the very briefest introduction of the speakers. You have fuller bios in the materials, and also for anybody in this conference or in this room, you probably know all four of them quite well. The chair of the session, Ambassador Sam Lewis, who spent a little time in foreign service and I think was ambassador for the United States to Israel, but we love him here because he was the first president of the Institute of Peace in our early years. He's going to be joined first by David Makovsky, who's one of the probably most widely recognized commentators on this question. He's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dr. Ziad Asali, who's the only real doctor on the panel, from the American Task Force on Palestine, and Ambassador Dan Kurtzer, who's a great friend of the Institute and a co-author of a recent book, I understand, called Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace. Ambassador Kurtzer was ambassador to both Israel and Egypt. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ambassador Lewis.
Thanks, Scott. If you don't want to listen to me, obviously you can listen to people next door. You have a choice. Not sure who that is, but we have to share the space. We thought we would do this, as Scott suggested, in a little different format, and that's one reason why this screen is up here, because since we're not on a rostrum, anybody after the fifth row can't see us, but you can look up there and see us, I think. I'm going to pose initially some questions to the panel, one at a time, and then we'll get eventually to the audience. But I'm trying to encourage the panel to do this in dialogue form, and so I asked them not to prepare long statements to take up the first half hour, which is typically what happens in panels. And they were quite pleased, since they had to work less, or they thought they were going to have to work less. It seems that events have conspired to make this yet again one of those moments in Middle East history when it's appropriate to have such a discussion. There are many of those moments over the years, too many. But the events in Gaza have certainly focused everybody's attention on the military side of the conflict, as well as the political side. And so the longer range questions about peacemaking in this next administration we will get to, but I want to start with the immediate crisis. I think that's on everyone's mind. And certainly there was a new development this morning with the report that there had been some missiles launched from Lebanon on Nahariya. An old folks' home apparently was hit, probably by one of the Palestinian groups in Lebanon, but nobody had claimed credit for it when I was driving in, at least. I want to start with David Makovsky. David, in a few words, how long is this going to last? What do you think the outcome's going to be? How do you analyze or comment about the reports of the split in the Israeli leadership about how long to go on with this operation, whether or not to have a ceasefire agreement, or whether just to stop it without an agreement. And such questions also, if you want to, how much of a complication will this crisis be in Israel's politics? Will the election be postponed, as is now being discussed very likely, from February 10th, somewhat later? How much can Lebanon complicate the outcome in Gaza if there is more exchanges of fire with Lebanon, as the Israelis have been worrying about and preparing for? But I think the first question I'd like you to address is the first one. Is there going to be a ceasefire in effect before the president-elect takes office?
Okay. Thank you, Sam. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know if the mic works. Does it work? Okay. I just want to say I'm very honored to be here with you, Sam, and Scott, and many distinguished guests that I see here in the audience. So thank you very much for having me. Look, no one has a crystal ball, so the Middle East has a way of humbling everyone. So I'll try to just say what seems, from what I've been able to gather, where it is and where it's going. It seems, that it's clear that this crisis was precipitated by a security collapse. You had a tahadiyah, a lull, a calm, a ceasefire, however you want to use this phrase, for 6 months. And on December 19th, Israel was ready to renew it, to keep it going. So if that would have happened, we wouldn't be where we were. Hamas decided to fire hundreds of rockets from civilian areas indiscriminately against Israeli civilian areas, but believing it was immune from retaliation. Now, some say, no, Hamas basically viewed violence as a tool of negotiation. They really were going to agree to a ceasefire too, but they wanted to change it on their terms. But I don't think Israel saw it that way, and they were not about to change the terms of the ceasefire anyway, and they went in. Now, what are its options now? I think security-wise, it could go one of two ways. It's clear that the main issue, it seems to me, is stabilizing that border of Gaza and Egypt. That's where the rockets have been coming from. There's no other place, basically, it could come from. It could come from sea, but that doesn't seem to be the case now. The Grud rockets that have been the ones that have hit Beersheba, now they've hit places like Gadara, which is 20 miles south of Tel Aviv, Israel's main city, along its coast. And that's all been smuggled during the Tahadiyah. So I think there's a sense that, if you didn't like the book, you're going to hate the movie. And if you don't stop the Gruds, you're going to, within 6 months, there'll be rockets that will be able to hit Tel Aviv at will. So that leaves the Israelis, I think, two options. One is their preferred option, that Egypt basically create a structure on its end, not just in the Goli area of the border, but disrupt it downfield to make sure that there's no tunnel, rockets being smuggled, but instead that they're interdicted. And I think both the United States and Israel do not see this as a favor to the United States or Israel, but Egypt, as top Egyptian generals tell me, we don't want an armed Islamist state on our eastern frontier. This is not good for Egypt. So this isn't about doing anyone a favor, but it's about really defining a priority and creating a strategy to meet that objective. And I think if that is the case, that there's some clear security measures being undertaken, Israel will have no, clearly would like to withdraw. But if it does not do that, then I think that will create more pressure on Israel on the ground to move into the Philadelphia Road area, something it has avoided doing until now because that brings you into urban warfare with Rafah, which is a Palestinian city, and urban warfare is could be very tragic for all sides. So that is clearly a fallback position, but I tend to believe it's a fallback position that Israel would contemplate if the preferred position doesn't work. I will just speak as a political analyst here that I believe that you could be in a very unusual situation that how Egypt decides on this issue may also have implications on who is the next prime minister of Israel. It seems odd that the next Prime Minister of Israel will be decided in Cairo rather than Jerusalem. But I think politically, if Egypt insists on certain terms, the person who will gain the most will be Mr. Netanyahu, who is right now waiting in the wings, and will clearly pick up the pieces if he feels that this government is engaged in an operation that doesn't halt the rocket fire and doesn't stop the smuggling. So option one is preferred, clearly, but whether that option one materializes, I think we'll know in a few days. And if it doesn't, I suspect Israel would consider option two, which is continuing the military operation onto the Philadelphia Road with tragic consequences for all sides in the Rafah area. Clearly, I think Israel doesn't want this to go on beyond January 20th. But if it does so, that will be dependent on what Egypt decides. So we'll have to just stay tuned at this point.
Thanks, David. Do you think that the rising tide of criticism, to put it mildly, in world capitals and in the street of a lot of cities, which is now beginning to reach a high level, fed, of course, by unfortunate things like the shelling of the schools and the loss of life of civilians from areas where Israel believes that mortars were being fired, but so far the UN doesn't quite agree. Are these kinds of pressures from the horde of diplomats that are going into Ben Gurion Airport almost every day to try to get involved in the ceasefire negotiations from different countries, does any of that change any of the equation for Israeli decision-making, briefly?
That's a good question. I would, look, the Kana situation that tragically happened both in 1996 and 2006 did have an impact on the contours of the operation. The first time it brought it to a halt. The second time, it clearly was a turning point. So you have to be careful never to say never. And this is a horrible tragedy. Anyone who knows my views knows that I always believe if you need a solution that gives dignity to everybody, a solution that doesn't give dignity isn't a solution. So that has to be the goal. In terms of the United Nations, as you know, Sam, it's a much more complicated situation. And as someone who tries to analyze how they think over there, in Israel, my gut tells me the following. They will say, what moral authority or moral standing does the UN have to pass judgment when they never convened the Security Council, when Israelis were being shelled with 8,000 of these rockets since 2001? And therefore, they will not see that as, I think, as being decisive. But, they will ask what will bring security for their citizens and what will stop the next rockets from landing in Tel Aviv itself.
Okay, thank you, David. Ziad, let's move to the Palestinian side for a minute. What impact do you sense that this whole affair has had on public opinion and, more importantly, maybe on the political futures for President Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad? As the public support for Hamas, which has been written about a good deal as being on an upswing now in the wake of the invasion, has it gone up in the West Bank, in Gaza? Do we know? And what do you think the longer-term effect on the future of the Palestinian Authority is going to be from this very destructive crisis?
Thank you, Ambassador Lewis. If I may just say a couple of words about what David said. David
Sure.
is a friend of mine. I hate to disagree with him on anything, but I would like to say that the status quo ante was as unacceptable to the Israelis as it was for Hamas. The Hamas was in Gaza with a siege all around the people of Gaza, and it had serious constraints applied on its governing and on the miserable condition of the people of Gaza prior to the attack. So it had an investment in trying to change the status quo, as did Israel with the case that you made. The resolution or the time when we reach to a ceasefire will reflect how these two parties perceive the results of the combat, the military consequences, as well as the political implications. On the political implications, I would like to now address the Palestinian issue. Of course, the Palestinians were geographically, politically, ideologically, and physically divided in the first place, and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank was pretty much in control of the West Bank as Hamas was in Gaza. There was some opposition in both areas, but it was controlled opposition. Now the question, what is the impact of what's happening now? At this point in time, it's very clear that anybody, any Palestinian or Arab or Muslim who stands up for Israel, for the West, for the sense of injured dignity of the Palestinians would almost automatically gain support in the street, like you mentioned. But it also has been complicated by our modern times and the implications of pictures on TV and instant analysis, and this is a very, very watched event in the Arab and Muslim world, and in Arabs and Muslims in the West who have access to Arab media by satellite, and that has definitely outraged the people. The perception of the Palestinian Authority has not been very positive. Of course, it's eroded. The initial position of the Palestinian Authority was Hamas should have publicly stated, should have extended and accepted the tahdi'ah, and now fewer people are talking this language because of the anger in the street. Come ceasefire time and United Nations national security decisions made, and they could happen sooner, regardless of the possibility that they are unlikely to happen. They could happen. The terms of the ceasefire, the terms of the United Nations Security Resolution will have tremendous impact, political impact, on what happens in the Palestinian authorities. In fact, it may have impact way beyond what happens in Palestine. If it reflects the fact that the status quo prior to the fight has changed in favor of Hamas, the Palestinian Authority will be in an exceptionally weak position, as in fact the Arab governments who have initially supported it. But on the other hand, if it ends up with a situation where people would say, we fought all this and we lost all these losses, and we end up with still the same set of circumstances, and Hamas is even in a weaker position politically and decimated militarily, then of course by that time the position of the Palestinian Authority would improve. But I might just add a couple of caveats. The Arab street or public opinion are very important, as they are everywhere else. But let's look at the Palestinian Authority's position. The leadership has no alternative, has no credible alternative. There is no organized opposition for it in the West Bank. It has also a significant thing, which is control of the security apparatus in the West Bank. And it also has the legitimacy up till now, and will continue claiming the legitimacy beyond the January 9th because of the basic law requirement that the legislative elections have to take place at the same time as the presidential election. It's going to be very, very difficult to dislodge the Palestinian Authority from the West Bank. Having said that, everything is going to be riding in the long range. Now, all of these things are short-term prospects for the Palestinian Authority. In the long term, if the perception of the Palestinian people and the Arab people is that Hamas's position has actually paid off, and it extracted concessions and pushed back Israel, then it will have the upper hand, and that I'm sure everybody is aware of this, and that will be reflected in the upcoming resolutions, whether it's in the Egyptian-French proposal, or whether it's going to be reflected in what's happening now in the Security Council resolutions.
Thank you, Ziad. Now, our third panelist is Dan Kurtzer, and before I ask him the question, I want to just make a comment about him. Anybody who reads the New York Times, page 17 today, will find his name mentioned as a likely candidate for a high position in ye olde State Department. But he doesn't say anything about that, and nobody else does on the record, and they won't. So Dan necessarily is constrained, I think, just by the fact that I read the New York Times. He's constrained probably to say what he thinks the Obama administration is going to do about this mess. So I'm not going to mention that. I'm not going to ask him that question. I have to find questions I can ask him that I think he can answer. Hypothetical kinds of questions. So now let's see how it works. Dan, come March 15th, let's say. President-elect is now in office. He's president. We've, by this time, let's say there is a ceasefire in effect, surely. And let's say also that with that ceasefire, the immediate crisis has calmed down. There has been an election in Israel. We have this unknown new prime minister. But the administration has had time by then to consult with a lot of foreign leaders who always flock to Washington during the month of February and March, and maybe has sent out emissaries to go around and listen to everybody, which I imagine they will do, and try to figure out really what to propose. I'm not going to ask you what they should propose. You wrote about that anyway, you and Scot, in your book, basically. But the question is, how much impact do you think on the prospects for peacemaking has this Gaza crisis produced? For example, has the Turkish role changed with respect to Syria? One of the Syrian journalists, Sami Mubayyad, wrote a very interesting piece about how Mr. Erdogan's view of Israel has changed considerably over the last months, and particularly in the last 2 weeks. And of course, Turkey's been playing a very important role in indirect talks, mediating indirect talks between Israel and Syria. Will that be different after this crisis? And beyond that, you talked a lot in your book, yours and Scott's book, about lessons we've learned from this period of 30 years, more or less, of active peacemaking by the United States that you and I have both been involved in. How many of those lessons will look relevant in by March 15th, if any?
Well, thank you, Sam, for being a reader of the New York Times and saving me the caveat that I was going to start with. The fact of the matter is that I have 21 undergraduates waiting for me to teach a course at Princeton starting in the first week of February. That's the only fact on record right now. In responding to your question, Sam, I want to relate it to things that David and Ziad said as well, because anyone looking at either the broader conflict or the narrower issue at hand in Gaza has got to start with a question that I don't think anybody has an answer to, and that is, what are the goals that the various protagonists in this drama are pursuing? As Ziad indicated, that if you look back at the status quo ante, that both Israel and Hamas were unsatisfied or found that status quo ante unacceptable. I think if you applied that same question to the status quo post-conflict, one is going to find the same answer, that there will be an unacceptable situation on the ground, almost no matter how this particular phase relates to reality. And the reason I say that is because in normal conflict situations, I think you tend to see protagonists in one of three positions. Either they are diametrically moving in diametrically opposite directions, or they are moving towards each other in a conflict situation. In other words, they actually want to fight, or they may find themselves moving in parallel and you have a conflict management phase. What we're seeing, particularly between Israel and Hamas, is much more akin, I think, to that Monty Python skit of the 100-meter dash for runners who don't have a sense of direction. Because you've got Israeli and Hamas interests that don't correspond in any way. There is no mutuality of interests or mutuality of goals that the two sides can or have pursued that give us any sense that this particular phase of the conflict can end in any better situation than where we were 20 or 21 days ago. Hamas has pursued a strategy since its election in 2006, and particularly since its takeover of Gaza in 2007, of legitimizing itself as a potential government for all of Palestine, while also burnishing its credentials as a resistance movement. In other words, not only trying to govern, sometimes by persuasion and sometimes by coercion, but also trying to maintain the credentials that brought it to power in the first place, it believes. And that accounts for the rearming and re-equipping and the training that took place even during the ceasefire. On the other hand, Israel, since Hamas's election, and more particularly since Hamas's takeover of Gaza, has been looking for ways to bring Hamas down, not to see it become a legitimate interlocutor for Palestinians or as a legitimate partner, and certainly has seen Hamas's efforts at rearming and re-equipping as a dangerous threat to Israel, both in immediate terms, as we've seen in the rocket fire against Israeli towns and villages adjacent to Gaza, but also in larger terms of the deterrent that Israel believed that it lost or was weakened as a result of the war in Lebanon in 2006. So you have the goals and objectives of these two players moving in different directions. They're really not clashing directly at all times, nor are they running in parallel, but at various times they go in directions that make it very, very difficult to see any outcome either of this round or of the subsequent rounds in this confrontation lead us to a conclusion in which there will be some mutuality of interests that emerge from it. In that respect, on March 15th, no matter who wins the Israeli election, and no matter what other issues are on the agenda of the new American administration, one of the key questions that has to be asked is there a mutuality of interests in the larger Arab-Israeli arena with which an American administration can work? And this, in fact, was one of the main issues that Scott and I looked at in the book that we put out a little less than a year ago. First of all, a point we made then, which will remain relevant in our view no matter what happens in the weeks ahead, is that the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict and conflict resolution is a vital American national interest. It's not a favor we do for the parties. And that's very relevant even in terms of what President-elect Obama has already said about conflict resolution. When he was in the Middle East in July, he told Israelis and Palestinians that he intended to see the conflict resolution process on the part of the United States get off the ground much faster and with much more vigor than the current administration, and hopefully having assimilated the lessons of the past 15 to 20 years and being able to apply them. Now, if that's the case, then the United States on March 15th will have a very clear set of goals in mind. Number one, it is to try to bring about a conflict-ending resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, whether it's between Israelis and Palestinians or Israelis and Syrians. There's been a lot of talk in academic circles, even among policymakers, of whether or not all the parties know the way this thing will end, and there probably is a division of views in this room, but that can be tested. The issues have on the table in both sets of negotiations have been vented and articulated enough over the years that exploratory phases or consultative phases can probably be telescoped in relatively shorter times so that we can get to a period in which parties actually have to confront tough decisions about territory, about the nature of peace, about security, about the myriad legal issues, water, the electromagnetic spectrum, the airspace, the range of issues that need to accompany any kind of an agreement. Economic relations. These are all issues that I don't want to say are ripe for resolution, but the diplomatic toolbox relating to these issues is not a mystery anymore. And so if you have an American administration in which the president-elect has already said he wants to get off to a fast start, and if you have a prime minister elected in Israel who is prepared to move, and a Palestinian president prepared to move, then in one respect, however the situation in Gaza emerges should not deter an active round of diplomacy. It'll obviously influence what our various envoys do. They're going to have to spend time in a lot of cleanup operations, reconstruction and humanitarian assistance in Gaza, security frameworks involving Israel and Egypt and Palestinians with respect to smuggling, political issues that are going to remain unresolved until there is some form of national dialogue possible within the Palestinian community. The regional implications, especially in light of the overnight situation in Lebanon. If it's a one-off firing of rockets, then the regional implications issue may be controllable. But what if it's not? And what if, in fact, the conflict spreads? It doesn't mean, however, Sam, that on March 15th, the current situation needs to become a kind of barrier to an effective U.S. role to try to move this process forward.
But, Dan, do you think that you can get past some negotiating to an agreement with half of Palestine?
Well, I think this was a question that has been well debated since the Annapolis conference. And there was this, I think, ill-fated attempt to think about what was called a shelf agreement, that you could somehow negotiate an agreement, put it in mothballs until such time in which it could be implemented. That was never to be. But there at least was a more reasonable proposition that was articulated during this period, which suggested that even if the Palestinian community needs to be unified in order to implement an agreement, it may be possible to have an agreement negotiated with the legitimate authority of the Palestinian government, and then have that agreement subjected to a referendum or a national election or some test within the Palestinian community, let the people decide whether they like it or not. Because I think there is a generally held view that it would be impossible to implement an agreement covering the West Bank and Gaza as long as the Palestinian government is bifurcated. But I don't think we have fully tested the proposition that it may be possible to negotiate such an agreement and then have Palestinians decide whether it's an agreement that they want to see implemented and therefore would require some form of national dialogue, national reconciliation.
One of the things which often arises is that newspapers think they reflect public opinion or follow it. I was intrigued today by my reading of the New York Times again. This time the op-ed page. The New York Times is not viewed as an anti-Israeli newspaper except by some Israelis, but generally not in the United States, I think. And it's fascinating that you have 3 articles that really dominate the op-ed page today on the effect of the Gaza crisis. One by Nick Kristof, who always gets very worried about human rights violations wherever they happen, so he's really strong on that. Rashid Khalidi, who is, despite the views of some, probably one of the very best historians of the region in the United States, of Palestinian origin, and a very respectable figure in academia, and Gideon Litchfield from The Economist, and all 3 of them essentially are laying out some problems for a new administration, in my mind. And it comes back to the question I raised earlier. When Al Jazeera has free access in Gaza, but no Western journalists do, it's not too surprising that all over the world, not just in the Arab world, the pictures of violent suffering by children and the mistakes of the military create a kind of atmosphere. Now, the question that I wonder is about the United States. We asked the question about what effect does that have in Gaza among the Arabs. What effect does this dimension of the conflict, the human rights dimension, undoubtedly stressed by UN officials and by others, and fed by pretty one-sided television pictures, partly because the Israelis don't want to let anybody else into Gaza. How might that affect a new administration's ability to launch a kind of even-handed or pro-Israeli and even-handed initiative around March 15th or March 30th? Or is that really not something to worry about for them? Who wants to answer that? Dan, if you can, if you want to. You want to try?
Well, I'll start by suggesting that I think it would be not credible to believe that human rights and humanitarian concerns would not be on the agenda. Let me put it in a double negative. First of all, one of the only things that President-elect Obama has said during this crisis has related to his concerns about the impact on the human condition in both sides. And you know, therefore, that he is thinking about this even as he clearly must be thinking about the politics, diplomacy, and security issues. Secondly, while diplomats tend to focus on diplomatic solutions, those solutions have to operate within an environment which is tolerable in the societies in which they're being played out. And in both Israel and Palestinian society, the perception of human rights abuses against one's own party are serious enough that they become a part of the mix. Israeli society found it unacceptable for a large part of its population to be subjected in 2006 to the threat of Hezbollah rockets, and now in 2008, 2009 to the threat of Hamas rockets. And Palestinian society would find it equally unacceptable that the response to those rockets would carry such an intense civilian cost to those who are not combatants. And so for those of us, whether in government or out of government, trying to think about how you put the diplomatic pieces together on this chessboard, one can't ignore the fact that that chessboard is populated by people who are being affected every day. And that's why I think the articles in the Times today are so important, because it's a reminder of the context in which diplomacy takes place.
Ziad?
Yeah. I think this crisis is just one more crisis that should, and hopefully it will be the last one, to bring the basic conflict into sharp contrast. What it is about, what needs to be done about it, and what exactly is the United States' interest in this whole issue. There's been an emerging consensus about the two-state solution. It's been codified, the roadmap, quartet, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody can claim with any degree of seriousness that the implementation effort has matched the policy that was proclaimed. So what is happening now, shows us once again that this conflict is not a flat plateau, it is a downward slope. It always and invariably gets worse. This crisis will make it worse, no matter what they agree on. The pictures, the TV coverage, it is absolutely horrendous. These are not made-up pictures. These are pictures of real human beings suffering, and it is nobody can be more sensitive to the suffering and the threat of the Israeli people than people who understand that we need to have the Israeli people on board to implement a two-state solution. They need to see it as it is their interest to do that. This, again, brings us to the issues of what can we do to make this not a downhill slope till we are able to grope with it. We need to buy time. Clearly, nobody's quite equipped now to deal with it and give us an agreement tomorrow. What we propose and what I think should be given more attention is how to prevent this from being a downhill slope. Categorically, I would say the one single thing that has consistently made this issue worse is the settlement expansion and settlement building in the West Bank, which had made the creation of a Palestinian state less and less feasible. Whatever happens, I think this should be on top of the priority list of the incoming administration, to find a way to give cover to the Israeli politicians to maintain this present status quo of settlement expansion by freezing it. And if the United States' new president, who promises change and all kinds of good things, takes this position not as a coercive measure against Israel, but as a friendly strategic alignment between the interests of the United States and Israel, that'd be a very good thing. And I do not say that this should be done in vacuum. There should be an exchange. There should be something that is given to the prime minister who would do this, and there are many options that can be given. But you know, this cannot go on with any expectation of a two-state solution being, you know, credibly defended. There are many things that we can say that have weakened the position of the PA. The major one was that, what has your policy of moderation given us? This is something that can be given, and this is something that the Israelis can give if they are really interested in a two-state solution.
You know, I have a whole long list of questions, and we've got to get to the audience here. I know. I want to ask one more and ask for a pretty quick answer. David, what do you think the impact will be on the Syrian Israeli negotiating track, and has it been damaged or not by these events?
I tend to think that the very interests that led Syria and Israel to Turkey to talk to each other are going to be the same interests that will continue after this episode ends. And Netanyahu, of all people, while I have, you know, we don't know how far he will go on the Palestinian issue. I think a lot of our assessments on the peace process has to be contextualized by the outcome of the elections in Israel, should they be held next month. I think actually on the Syria track, you would have more of a consensus, ironically, to proceed with that. I think Livni, if she wins, she would proceed as well. But she would also have her eye very firmly on the Palestinian issue. Netanyahu may, it depends on the sort of government. He might have be part of a unity government. Depends what the configuration is. But I think what's fascinating on the Syria track is that the biggest proponents inside Israel for peace with Syria are not, let's say, a group called Peace Now, which is an advocacy organization, but it's the Israeli military at its highest echelons that believes peace with Syria is important for a new, I would say, a strategic reorientation in the region. They see, you know, people talk about the quartet, meaning the U.S., Europe, Russia, the UN. The other quartet is Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Syria. That second quartet, only one of the four elements is not an Islamist entity, and that is the Syrians. And I think that a lot of Israelis believe peace with Syria is a good within its own right, but it could also have important strategic consequences for the region. It could break the chain, so to speak, of that second quartet as the rockets go, like a double play combination, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah. So I think that, you know, this is something to look for. Ironically, Netanyahu in 1998 tried through a confidant of his in the United States, had reached the negotiations reached a very advanced stage with the Syrians, and might have been concluded, but a fellow named Ariel Sharon, who's now in a coma, tragically, blocked it. I think if he wins, he will pick up where he left off. And I think if Livni wins, she will also pursue that track as well. Because, again, it is the military that is influential in Israel. They're the ones saying, what do you have to lose by talking? Try it. See what works. And I believe that the parties are sitting in Turkey not because the United States twisted any arms, but because each side, from their own national interest, and I think on the Syrian side, given all their economic catastrophic situation today, see peace as their ticket towards a better future, and not just a return to economic ties with the West, but also a return to the Arab fold. And Syria, let's be honest, has been on the outs with many leading Arabs like the Saudi Arabia and Egypt because of their relationship with Iran. peace will be a fresh start for Syria. It works for both of these parties. That's why they're in Turkey, and that's why they're counting on the Obama administration to be vigorous in support in 2009.
Well, I hope you're right, David. That's more about Israel than it is about Syria. It's time for some questions, and I see a guy who knows something about Syria, Ambassador Ted Katouf. You get the first question. I want to stand up, Ted, and there are supposed to be mics around here somewhere.
Just to follow up, Ambassador Lewis, on your question and on Ziad Asali's comments about settlements, I mean, many of us who favor a two-state solution do wonder when the sell-by date makes it impossible, precisely because of the issues that Dr. Asali raised in the settlements, the proportional representation system in Israel. Meanwhile, as David Makovsky has pointed out, even a Netanyahu-led government would probably find its way over some months to picking up where things left off with Syria. So I'd like to ask, perhaps...
But what about the Syrian reaction?
Well, the Syrian, you know, we're only going to ultimately know the Syrian reaction when they're tested. Syrians, in my mind, are ready to proceed on a track sponsored by the United States with Israel towards peace. Obviously, they'd like to see something going on the ground in Palestine. They'd like to see progress there. But I think they have said, both in the 90s, and I think they've probably hinted at it today, that they're willing to move forward in any case. So I think it would be nice if we test the proposition, because that's the only way we're ever going to know whether they will actually do a deal or not do a deal. If everybody knows what the parameters would have to look like, the Syrians are fond of saying 85% of the issues have been resolved. There might be water issues relating to the Sea of Galilee and tributaries and the like, but by and large, everybody knows what this thing would have to look like. So it would appear to be low-hanging fruit compared to the much more complex and politically difficult Palestinian track. So my question is, perhaps to Ambassador Kurtzer, is what do you think an Obama administration should do if approached by Israel and Syria? Because they are going to be, almost certainly. And how would that fit into what we're doing with the Palestinians?
Well, Sam answered that question in introducing me. I really can't speculate about what an Obama administration can do, as I'm sitting on the transition team. But the question is a good one.
We happen to have an expert on Syria in the person of the Syrian ambassador here on the front row. You want to give us a quick statement about Syria's point of view, Mr. Ambassador?
Yes, thank you very much. I'll try to be as succinct as possible. I don't claim to be as expert on Syria as the other gentlemen here in this room, but I want to say the following. Throughout this discussion, the viewpoint of Hamas was totally absent. Well, this is usually the case here in the United States, except for today. While I agree with you that the New York Times is an ardent supporter of Israel, but an even more ardent supporter of Israel, the Washington Post has published this morning a very important article by Jimmy Carter, who happens to be the only person from the United States of America that talks to Hamas. And he has a very different story to tell. People here usually comfortably sit on their arm seats and discuss what Hamas wants and what Hamas does not want, but they never talk to Hamas. The only other American I know that has talked also to Hamas and Hamas leaders happens to be a journalist, Seymour Hersh. Both President Jimmy Carter and Seymour Hersh have a very different story that is never ever heard here in the United States. Regardless, I'm only suggesting that someone should discuss what Jimmy Carter has written today in the Washington Post. Now, the other point that is very important is the following. The massacre that is happening today in Gaza, the primitive makeshift rockets that were thrown on Israel, the settlements, everything else, the rift between Hamas and Fatah, are all are all symptoms of the big elephant in the room that was not mentioned one single time throughout all this session. Since we started till now, not a single person mentioned the word occupation. The reality is even if you go to what is the status quo ante? It is one nation under occupation, under humiliation, under suffering, because of the sheer military superiority of another nation. This is the problem. The big question, since I'm not in the Obama transition team, I would say the following. If President Obama and his administration will move from the philosophy of conflict management to the philosophy of conflict resolution and address all the issues, then we will have hope in our region. Otherwise, the discussion about the atrocities in Gaza, the atrocities that took place in Lebanon 2 years ago, and many other atrocities will be repeated time and again every couple of years. It breaks the heart to say this, but this is the reality. Unless we will have a bold strategic vision to address the whole issue of the Middle East, making peace, ending occupation, we will keep on going around and around and around. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I might just speak for Syria in this case. I take what you've said to mean that if the Obama administration launches such a broad peace resolution policy, Syria will not avoid taking part. Thank you. Let's get further back. The gentleman in the middle back there. You want to identify yourself?
Matthew Kalishman. I just wanted to ask people on the panel, we've been talking about governmental level, but how do we build a constituency for peace amongst the people, which is going to be the most important part?
Which people?
Oh, sorry, Palestinians and Israelis.
Well, Ziad?
Yes, adopt and implement the right policies. The Honorable Ambassador from Syria mentioned that nobody talked about the occupation, but I think we talked about a two-state solution, which means establishing a state of Palestine alongside Israel, which is precisely what it is that you're talking about. If the policies of implementing the agreed upon, the internationally agreed upon two-state solution is not implemented, then there is no amount of understanding between Jews and Christians and nice people on this side that are going to do anything that is helpful. That does not in any way diminish the absolute significance of humanizing each human being everywhere. And this toxic, poisonous, unacceptable public discourse where Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, Jews, Christians, the West are denigrated into Satan, wherever the source of has to stop, and this has to be an international project, and this has to do very much with the question that Sam asked about what's happening with the public discourse. What's acceptable in the public discourse just should not be acceptable. More voices have to be heard. But going back to the fundamental issue, the right policies implemented. And let's see that the opposing forces understand that there has to be a tomorrow. Nobody's going to be able to get the whole cake. You have to compromise. You must compromise. And this has to be a policy that cannot be managed. It has to be a conflict-ending policy.
David, 1 minute.
It seems, I'd like to echo something Ziad says about we need to change the discourse. Of everyone in the region. If the moderates cannot find a way to acknowledge when the moderates on the other side have done something, you will never build a center in these societies. And what has to happen is also the regimes need to come together and to delegitimize extremism. And if the case of Hamas, I would like to hope that we'd have Arab leaders who will say that Hamas drives the hope of Palestinian statehood farther and farther away. What have these rockets achieved? All they've done is harden Israeli attitudes that peace is possible. Why would Israel want to get out of the West Bank when they ended the occupation in Gaza, and all they've got were these lousy rockets. So this is crucial. Now, you can say on the other side, Israel needs to also delegitimize its extremists. Fair enough. But the discourse is crucial, and it cannot be this mutual demonization that's going on. And frankly, I hate to say it, but I think you see the demonization much greater in the Arab media. And unless we realize that demonization, unless that changes, we're nowhere. Not all Palestinians obviously are terrorists. 99.99 are not. And we need to say that too. This demonization has to stop.
I think we've got about time for one more question. Who's really eager? Here's the lady who's been eager for a long time. Mike?
My name is Amal Mudallali. I'm advisor for Mr. Hariri of Lebanon. My question is about Lebanon. You're right, Ziad. I was wondering today, as we talked before, there were 4 rockets fired on Israel from South Lebanon. So somebody is trying to drag Lebanon to another war and another tragedy the same one we had 2006. Hezbollah denied any responsibility. Nobody in Lebanon is supporting that. The government said that this is violation of 1701. They're still committed to it and to the ceasefire. So my question is, do you expect, if this continues, of any regional conflict coming out of this, meaning between Israel and Syria? My second question is for Ambassador Kurzer. When you mentioned about the March 15th and the kind of approach the administration is going to have, you were talking about having Israeli, Palestinian, Syrian, Israeli negotiations. You didn't mention Lebanon. What kind of role do you see for Lebanon at this stage, and what kind of peace that will come on that track? Thank you.
I don't want to sound facile about the idea of a regional conflict, but a regional conflict will only happen if the parties want it to happen. The Israeli government has made it clear that it does not want to regionalize this conflict. So far, the Lebanese government has said the same. I think the same can apply for the Syrian government. And so if everyone's careful about how they conduct themselves and how they respond to untoward incidents, this probably doesn't have to escalate. The Israeli response to the rockets overnight was directly related to the source of the fire and did not seek to expand that particular area of conflict. One would hope that there would be no fire from Lebanon, that the Lebanese army would play a role that we've been waiting for it to play for many years, and be able to take security control of that area. So as long as the respective governments involved both have no interest and have indicated no particular desire for regionalizing this conflict, it does not have to happen. With respect to Lebanon in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict resolution process, there are all indications that a Lebanese-Israeli dialogue could result in a very quick agreement. Issues relating to territory, relating to water, relating to security, are well known, and the solutions to those problems are well known. But it's going to require commitment on the part of the Lebanese government to a negotiation to which it has not agreed in the past. So if March 15th, April 15th, we're picking a date out of the air, but if at some point the Lebanese government said it's ready for negotiations, I have no doubt that Israel would be equally ready, and an American administration ought to be able to exploit that opportunity and move that rather rapidly towards a successful conclusion.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We talked too much, you didn't talk enough, but I think this has been a good, frank exchange among friends who disagree about some things. But generally, I think we all support the hope that a new period of American peacemaking, not conflict management, may come about in the near future. Thank you all very much.